There's an American tale with a difference now on BBC Learning Zone as members of the Japanese-American community in Los Angeles describe their experiences.
Manzanar is a totally different kind of scenic environment. You're at the foot of Mount Whitney, but of course there are barbed wires and towers with searchlights and guards and machine guns. So that was a very sobering aspect of it.
We were Americans, and the Constitution, we thought, would protect us. And the Constitution didn't work. We didn't think of ourselves as being Japanese. So why was it that we were put into camps?
Japanese Americans have a unique story to tell about the nature of being American. A story rooted in the fact that their forebears journeyed eastwards to America. It's August 1993, the Little Tokyo district in downtown Los Angeles. This parade is the high point of Nisei Week, the annual celebration of being Japanese American. For many, this is an annual outing to the place where their families first put down roots 100 years ago. This remains their main link with their ethnic community. But for others, Little Tokyo is a place to carry on family businesses founded 2 generations ago.
Very few people in the United States know this, how to make this, and I think I'm one of 3 in the United States that are 3rd generation Japanese that can make this. I myself probably prefer having a piece of cheesecake and a donut with my coffee rather than a piece of Japanese pastry. But then again, too, I make it all day, so it's kind of hard.
The Keto shop was 90 years old in 1993. None of the family still live in Little Tokyo. They prefer the comfort and security of suburban Los Angeles. So does the Mori family, which used to supply the Keto shop with raw materials.
Fugetsu-do was a store that we delivered mochi to for the New Year's holidays. And so this part of town is like home to me. I come down here fairly often. My business brings me down here. But I talk to my other friends, and a lot of them say that they rarely get down to Little Tokyo now.
The community, now some 750,000, has mostly dispersed into the great mosaic of American culture. But if you do want to stay in touch, you can read Rafu Shimpo, the bilingual daily newspaper published in Little Tokyo. Also celebrating its 90th anniversary in 1993, it has for most of its life been owned by the Komai family.
I hear stories about people who look back and they say the newspaper was always on their coffee table. They look at the paper every day. When we had delivery people, the subscribers would wait on their doorstep for our delivery boys to drop the paper off. If that's any indication that we play a central part, then yes, we do.
As we'll see later, the newspaper is no longer targeted just at Japanese Americans, but at the growing Japanese business community of Los Angeles. Indeed, Little Tokyo as a whole is striving to survive and prosper by encouraging the wider community to appreciate its special character. A relatively new institution is the Japanese American National Museum, where I met another third-generation member of the Komai family.
It was actually incorporated in 1985. A group of World War II veterans and some little Tokyo businessmen got together and decided that this was a way to protect the heritage that they had so painstakingly worked to create in the first place. Obviously, the events of the last 100 years for Japanese in this country have proved to be significant for the entire United States. And when they put the museum together, they had in mind having a museum that wasn't just for Japanese Americans, but for all Americans.
Let's hear something of the Japanese-American story, using the memories and insights of the Komai, Kito, and Mori families, amongst others, and the museum's first major exhibit. Almost all of the Japanese ever to migrate to the USA did so during the 40 years around the turn of the century. They were the Issei, the first generation.
Dad came over in 1892, and he landed in Victoria, Canada. Went to work as a lumberjack, I think. Worked his way down and decided California was the place to come to. And he worked his way down, ended up in Sacramento, and started working on with the, I guess you'd call them the migrant workers that followed the crops. Worked his way down through Fresno, ended up in Riverside with a couple of friends of his and decided to open a store. And that was the beginning of his life, I guess, as a merchant.
If you look at recessions and depressions in Japan, there's probably a good correlation between at least movement out of the country, sort of the push-pull kind of thing, pushing out of the country, being pulled in towards economy that seemed to be much better than the old one. I guess unfortunately they followed the Chinese, and by the early 1900s the anti-Chinese feelings were so strong that they totally banned Chinese immigration, and the Japanese unfortunately came right after that.
My father came on in 1919 and with me. I was baby. He had a real hard time because discrimination was real bad, and other people throw the tomato to my father's face, and he was really, disgusted.
Initially, I think a lot of them went into agriculture because, as some of our historians indicate, agriculture, you didn't need too much education, you didn't need any skills, you didn't need capital in order to just work in the farms. But I think most of them, or at least my father and a lot of people that I know, then migrated to the cities. Primarily Los Angeles, San Francisco, maybe Sacramento, and some of the valley towns.
He came to Los Angeles in 1902, started over here on Alameda, and started a store with a couple of friends of his, and operated a hotel above the store.
I think they turned to themselves, and so they developed their own communities. And in a way, that was sort of the saving grace, because it gave them opportunities that they would never find in the mainstream. In fact, they were so totally rejected that instead of even occupying the lowest rungs of the ladder, and a lot of them did, many of them started to service their own communities. So you got some doctors and lawyers and some professionals. It must have been very difficult in those days. But still, that seemed to be one of the ways of maintaining some degree of autonomy and independence in the face of racist policies. You have to remember that the initial generation, they could not become citizens because they were alien. There were laws making them permanent aliens. But the second generation, the American-born ones, were American citizens by birth. They went to the American schools. They were exposed at least to the mainstream American culture.
I grew up in mainly an Occidental community, and so as far as my contact with Japanese is concerned, I would say that mainly one family who lived near us. I guess we're just a typical American family of Japanese ancestry. Went to the same school, same junior high, same high school, and ended up in the same university as the rest of the children.
I think we sensed something which made us want to become Americans, be identified, because of this business of being called something like a Chinaman, which, I mean, for the Caucasian, they didn't make a distinction between one Asian and another. I guess they hadn't learned the word Jap at that point.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
War with Japan led many people to question the loyalty of Japanese Americans, although no evidence, let alone proof of disloyalty, has ever been offered. The military wanted to evacuate all Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast for security reasons, and they found support among powerful West Coast politicians pandering to public hysteria. The president ignored advice that evacuating citizens could be unconstitutional, and on February 19, 1942, he authorized the army to evacuate all Americans of Japanese ancestry from the western portions of the Pacific states. Only a few weeks later, the evacuation began. Houses, household goods, business premises, and stocks all had to be sold or put into safekeeping. Fortunes, large and small, were lost, never to be fully recovered. Over 110,000 people were evacuated. The General Staff chose 10 remote sites and hastily built camps to serve as relocation centers. Some call them concentration camps. The closest one to Los Angeles was in the Owens Valley at Manzanar.
The camp was situated on an old fruit orchard. So in all the fire breaks, there are, I forgot how many blocks there were, but between each block is a big fire break. And most of the fire breaks were filled with beautiful trees, fruit trees. But of course there are barbed wires and towers with searchlights and guards and machine guns. So that was a very sobering aspect of it.
We were on the edge of the Dust Bowl in Colorado. And when we got off the train, you couldn't see a foot in front of you. And my son was just 5 or 6 months old, and I covered him totally with a baby blanket so he wouldn't have to breathe in all that dust. And it was, I think, the saddest day of my life. To come to a place like that, and the wind was blowing so hard, and tumbleweeds everywhere, and they put us on the back of a truck from the train and drove us into camp.
It was always the sense that we had to keep the family together. We all lived in, at the beginning, in one large room, my whole family, which consisted of my mother and my sister, my brother, and my sister's girlfriend, and my wife and I.
Going to the mess hall, we were lined up, and we used to get a lot of bread pudding. I just hated that. And I used to get a lump in my throat every time we ate, because that's not the type of food I was used to.
I couldn't sleep for about 5 days. I lost about 10 pounds. I was skinny anyway, but that time was really skinny. I was about 120 pounds, but I became 110 pounds because I was, I couldn't sleep. Yeah, the whole time. Then after that, I get sick all the time.
I was 15-year-old when I entered the camps, and for the first several months, it was again like going to a summer camp, at least on one level. We didn't have to go to school. We didn't have to study. We organized our own little leagues, and so we played baseball, football, basketball. And so for the first several months, it was almost like a vacation, except obviously there were barbed wire fences. We couldn't go out. We missed a lot of the things that we thought were a normal part of the American culture, like eating hamburgers, going to ball games and things like that, although we were playing now, but still it was within very restricted quarters.
Eventually, the camps had hospitals, schools, and night schools, and provided employment. They were largely self-governing and developed many of the organizations, clubs, and facilities of any small American town. As time passed, it became possible to leave the camps if you joined the army or if you had somewhere to go in the eastern United States. But however successful the inmates were in dealing with the situation, the stark fact of imprisonment remained.
You just don't know how precious that word freedom, what it's all about, till you have lost it. And you have to order from Sears catalog, and everyone has to share the latrines and the washrooms and all. You just don't know.
Inevitably, people died here during the 3.5 years of relocation, although there were very few deaths as a result of violence. Running through the whole experience was a need to make sense of what had happened.
We could see the highway that ran past Manzanar, and I remember at times standing at the fence, the front end of the camp, and watching every now and then some solitary car driving by. All the faces were white. And so I think for us it was clear that the reason we were there was a consequence of who and what we were. And I think that was what was confusing for us later as we started growing up and understanding more clearly, and I think as older adults, what the experience was all about.
How does one deal with the fact that your own government puts you in a camp?
Yeah, well, I guess there's so many ways. One, of course, is to rationalize that maybe the government made a mistake, which was pretty common.
We were Americans, and the Constitution, we thought, would protect us. And the Constitution didn't work. And why didn't it work? It just seemed incredulous that our government, our own government, would do this to us, because we were American citizens. We didn't think of ourselves as being Japanese. And so why was it that we were put into camps with barbed wires, and they said, we're protecting you.
The guns were pointed at
And they had these guard towers, and the guns were pointed at us.
For me, it was a very complex kind of a thing, because I think all the years before the war, I worked so hard at being an American, perhaps to the degree that I was almost anti-Japanese. And when this happened, it was so hard to believe that someone was now identifying me with the enemies. And as a consequence, as you went into camp, you found that this was a kind of a pendulum thing, where you were at one point very, very American. Now the pendulum swung around, and you found yourself sympathetic with the other side. And then along the way, someplace, I think it began to even itself out, and you began to find a realistic viewpoint of the whole thing.
We have, I guess this is an old Japanese saying, but it's called shikata ga nai, things that you have no control over, don't worry about them. And it's something that I feel brought us through the whole thing without losing our perspective.
Some of the questionnaires that we were asked to answer was so stupid, I would have to call it, where they would ask us to pledge, or what was it? Do you remember the phrase, Con, where you had the forswear allegiance to the emperor, and something, and if you answered yes, that meant that you did at one point swear allegiance to the emperor, and you said this is ridiculous to even answer it.
And we haven't talked about it much until recently. When we came out of camp, we didn't want to talk about it.
Why?
Somehow, no one wanted to talk about it.
We just wanted to forget about it.
I don't think we told our children very much about it because we didn't want to discuss it. It was a part of our history and background that was so tragic and so sad, and we wanted to put it behind us and forget about it. But it's our children who have insisted on discussing this subject and asking us more about it and asking us to talk about it, explain what happened to us.
Actually, I think what happened is, in America, what happened in the 60s was the civil rights movement brought to the forefront of the fact that a lot of groups in the United States had undergone a lot of discrimination. And I think that's when, my mom was talking about the Sansei generation, third generation. They became more aware of the camps then, and were looking for things to get behind as far as civil rights. To be honest, I don't know about my brothers. I really didn't have a real sense of what the camps were like until I was in college.
I was in high school, and I was writing a senior paper, and I didn't know what to write about, so I'd gone down to the library and gone through the card catalog to see if I could find some new topic that I could write about, and I came across a book that documented the relocation of the Japanese from the West Coast. And I thought, gee, this might be a subject that, that I should look into. I really didn't know very much about that history. I remember showing you the paper, and I remember you reading it, and Dad, and saying that this may not be something that, where did you get the material? This may not be something that I would want to write about. And I said, no, this is something I wanted to write about. And it was then that you directed me to the attic in the old house on Van Buren and told me to go up to the attic and look into the boxes that were marked camp, which had all of the Senate subcommittee books, all the literature from, I guess, from the camp in Colorado. And that's when I really became aware of what had transpired.
I didn't consciously not tell the children. It was just something that never occurred to me, I guess, and we didn't talk much about camp, or mainly it was we had enough problems trying to get along.
No, but when we were growing up, and I remember you were saying that you met Dad in camp, but when I was growing up, I thought it was like summer camp or recreational kind of thing. And then not until I learned about it in school that I realized that it was, internment camp.
A lot of the things that I hear from my parents are having to do with the good things that happen in camp, and their friends that they made in camp, and the close acquaintances that they still have. People come to the store still now and ask how my parents are, and they say, "Oh, I knew your parents from camp."
I think the thing is that if you look back at what is conveyed now, what's remarkable to me about what our parents did was that even though they went through this experience, that they did not pass on really the bitterness that they could have, that they did not pass on that kind of heritage, even though it certainly would have been in their right to do that. So that in growing up, that we didn't have maybe these ambivalent feelings we might have had for this country. On the other hand, too, it's important for us, for our generation, and all the generations, as my mother used to say, is that everyone should know this happened because it could happen to anyone, really.
By the late 1970s, almost everyone did know what had happened, due to a campaign to obtain redress. Eventually, a congressional committee was formed to make a report. John Tateishi was one of the leaders of the redress campaign.
The report came out in 1982 with the findings that the events of 1941-42, the internment, were unjustified, that it was a result of racism and a lack of political leadership in the country. And they came out with a recommendation of $20,000 compensation to those who were still living. And also recommended an apology by the Congress to Japanese Americans who had experienced the internment. In 1988, the Congress passed the redress legislation, and it went to the White House, and Ronald Reagan signed it. And as of that moment that he signed the bill, anyone who was living on the registry of the government was eligible to receive redress. We were the first identified group in the United States to receive an apology for an injustice and to receive compensation for it. What was really important about that moment was the recognition for us that the government finally, the country, finally accepted us as Americans.
In the 1990s, the Japanese-American community is relatively successful, with a high level of academic, commercial, and professional achievement. Much of what was lost in the 1940s has been recovered. But is there still discrimination against these people from a different shore?
Yeah, I think the evidence shows that there's what we call the glass ceiling, that if you go to big private corporations, engineers or whatever, you'll find a lot of Asian Americans, not only Japanese, working very, very hard in the background, in the labs. But as you go up to the management positions, it gets less and less and less.
Good afternoon, Leap. May I help you? Well, we're a non-profit, nonpartisan organization. We were founded 10 years ago to develop new leaders in the Asian Pacific community.
LEAP was set up to help people break through the glass ceiling. All Japanese Americans, like the director of LEAP, now have an additional element in their official identity as members of the Asian Pacific American population.
There are 59 groups that make up and fall under the term Asian and Pacific Islander. which, by the way, is a political term. It was coined by the federal government to classify this huge group of individuals.
According to census data, there are now about 8 million Asian Pacific Americans. Fewer than 1 million are of Japanese ancestry.
Well, currently, the Filipino and the Chinese communities are the largest communities. However, up until 1970, the Japanese community was the largest community. But after 1965, with the relaxation of the immigration laws, a number of the other Asian Pacific groups have much larger populations. And there has been very little immigration from Japan, and so the Filipino and Chinese communities are the largest, followed by Korean community, the Vietnamese, Asian Indian communities. It's been difficult for the Japanese community. It has traditionally been in a leadership position in the Asian Pacific community. I guess it's hard to take the fact that you're not number one anymore. And the Japanese American community, I think, on the one hand, I think it's afraid it's going to be no more, and so it's intent on preserving sort of what we have.
At the museum, Chris Kermai sees at first hand the community's thirst for self-knowledge.
We get a lot of people who just say, thank you so much for doing this and for having this here. I think there is a sense of self-fulfillment or affirmation for our community when they see a building like this or an institution like this develop and finally be open right in front of their eyes.
Today we will be telling you a story of Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes. Sadako was born to be a runner. Her mother always said she learned to run before she could walk. A lot like many of you, I'm sure, huh? Today was August 6th, 1954, Peace Day. Every year on August 6th, we remember those who died in the atom bomb when it was dropped on our city. It is a day of remembrance. The atom bomb, the thunderbolt, had turned Hiroshima into a desert. Sadako said, I remember the thunderbolt. There was a flash of a million suns. Then the heat prickled my eyes like needles.
For Japanese Americans, a museum like this or an institution like this says that, yes, you are important. Yes, what you did does count today as it did then, and that your heritage will never be forgotten.
That's kind of funny.
I have my heritage. I have spam musubi and fried rice and things like that, because that's something that has come down from my grandparents. And it's something that I have and something I can pass. And it's real. It's substantial. I can eat it. I can taste it. I can hear it. And I can give it. And that's probably the most important thing. If you have something like that, you can give it. It's the only way that it'll survive. And as long as we're willing to do that, then we'll have a community.
But a lot of my friends, Japanese friends, they really have nothing to do with the culture, or they've nothing Japanese in their home, and they don't eat Japanese foods, or, and I would say they are assimilated into, American culture.
Growing up, I wasn't really, into really understanding all of Japanese culture, but now that I have children, I kind of feel that it should be an integral part of their lives. And I've become a little bit more culturally aware of, being Japanese American.
I'm very proud of my culture and heritage. I have the best of both worlds, I think. And we still have the anchor to the community in terms of going to the Buddhist church. Kathy plays a Japanese stringed instrument called the koto, which is years and years of history in terms of that. So we still maintain our cultural background, but we're very proud of having, I think, the best of both worlds.
Our heritage and our background was perhaps camouflaged because we were trying to assimilate into American culture. We were trying to be Americans, And I think that's very important. And I think we've gone full circle now, and we're saying to ourselves, it's time that we refocus and look at ourselves and review who we are. The third generation is putting an emphasis on language and the arts, and you're seeing more and more of that for the fourth generation.
Many of the fourth generation may start their life being well informed of their heritage, but as they grow older, they can leave it behind. One indication is that most have no problem with the idea of marrying a non-Japanese American.
First, obviously, there were anti-miscegenation laws right up through the 40s and 50s. But then, from that time on, the upward mobility in terms of occupation, education, social class, housing, meant that we were much more free to move. And as we moved, we began to find more equal opportunities even on the social level. And so the last series of studies we did, right up through the late 80s, shows that Japanese Americans in Los Angeles are out-marrying or marrying non-Japanese at well above the 50% rate.
As far as I'm concerned, I don't think that's an issue at all. It's a matter of a man and a woman finding each other and falling in love and getting married. And I don't think it makes any difference what ethnic group you're from or what race or religion.
We're very proud people. And I think that anybody that marries into the Japanese American community will also carry that sense of pride.
I do have some relatives that we have intermarriages, and most of them seem to gravitate towards the Japanese family side. And I think that it's going to be successful. I have no fears about it.
We had a reunion of some of our cousins, and in the reunion, out of, I think there were 11 second cousins, and Lauren and Aaron were the only two that were like full Japanese. The others are all half and half. And so in our family, there's a lot of intermarriage, and I think, the statistics for Japanese is that they are the highest minority to marry outside of their own, nationality or ethnicity. So.
And yet their children participate in cultural activities. They're dancers in Nisei Week. They take dance and other Japanese cultural things. So just the fact of the intermarriage doesn't stop them from participating in the culture.
Yeah, it's that old half empty, half full kind of thing. Half of the community feels that, the melting pot is working, we're really achieving something that we thought would never happen. And the other half would say, but that means the demise of the Japanese American culture, including the values, including sort of a way of looking at the world, which was sort of unique to the immigrant group.
Through the generations, then, values and opportunities change, but appearances don't.
The only thing that keeps them from becoming totally American and a part of the mainstream is still physical identifiability, because a surefire laugh in front of any Japanese American audience is you ask, has anyone ever said you speak English so well? And they all laugh because they've had something like that.
When I used to work at USC, at the University of Southern California, I would meet people, and they would inevitably always compliment me on how well I spoke English.
I remember going back to Kentucky, and the first thing they want to know is, how come you speak English so good? You want to say, well, I don't speak English because I speak it well.
But that sort of thoughtlessness can turn into racial tension when external forces come into play. Japan is once again seen by many as a threat to the USA. Corporate Japan is well established on the West Coast. Many of these skyscrapers belong to Japanese companies.
There's a lot of the well-publicized trade and economic tensions between the United States and where it used to be with just Japan, but now it's with many of the different countries in the Pacific Rim. That really, a lot of the countries don't realize that it's the Asian American community here in the United States that feels the backlash, that feels the heat when those tensions arise. And a lot of individuals in the community are really concerned because many of the Pacific Rim countries don't understand how to use their Asian Pacific American counterparts here in the U.S. Here in Little Tokyo, for example, there is a sharp division between the Japanese American community and the Japanese national community. And in many levels, they never ever meet. They may work right next to each other. They may eat at the same restaurants. They may shop at the same stores, but there is very little interaction between the two communities. You know, in Japan, there is a very structured class system, and you have to remember that all of the Japanese who immigrated to the U.S. were probably of the lowest class, and they didn't have anything going for them when they left Japan in the early 1900s, late 1800s. It's taken Japan a long time to get over the fact that the lowest class has done so well here in this country. And for the longest time, they really didn't pay any attention to us.
The Japanese, when they come over here, they want to come to Little Tokyo and eat Japanese food and, shop in Japanese shops.
Yes. Don Murray is a consultant who handles public approval processes for the real estate developers who are transforming downtown LA, just a few blocks away from Little Tokyo. Many of his clients are Japanese companies.
With your Japanese clients, are they any different from clients from elsewhere?
They do business a little differently. They are very tough on the front end when you're negotiating a project, but once the contract is put in place, they have a tendency to just move very quickly.
Do Japanese firms like working with the Japanese American community?
I think the Japanese firms are more partial to just having the competence. I don't think when it comes down to business, they really do just want the best person available for the job. And so whether I'm Japanese or not, it really doesn't make a difference in their mind.
But on the other side of the balance, Japan has brought new business to Little Tokyo as a provider of home comforts to expatriate Japanese all over the USA.
We sell at retail and we sell at wholesale. We ship it as far as Alaska and Hawaii. And a lot of our business goes out to Chicago, San Jose area, San Jose, California. Wherever there's a large population of Japanese, we generally have some success in shipping there.
And is it primarily the Japanese-American market?
It's mostly, nowadays, it's mostly the Japanese from Japan market. The Japanese-American, there's specific kinds that they will eat, but they generally don't crave this as much as the Japanese from Japan.
Have you ever been to Japan as we refine your skills?
I did. I went to Japan. Actually, I hired a professional from Japan to come and teach me even more. That was about 8 years ago. And we had him on a contract when we opened up our second store. And so he was here, one, to help us out in production, and number two was to teach me new pastries.
At Rafu Shimpo, the presence of the expatriate Japanese community encourages the newspaper to maintain its bilingual status.
On the Japanese side, we're looking at the Japanese corporate community and what I've been told are called expatriates, and trying to educate them in the ways of the local Japanese American community. On the Japanese American side, we're very much a local ethnic type paper, in which case our audience is a little different, and they're more Asian American in nature. 2 or 3 to 1 would be Japanese, so 67 to 75% would be Japanese reading, and 33% English reading.
Do I get the sense that your Japanese American readership tend not to read the Japanese pages?
In general, that's true, because most Japanese Americans do not speak or read Japanese. there is more interest now. But again, it has not been a common occurrence to be able to read and speak.
The subtle balance between the two parts of Japanese-American identity continues to shift in response to the wider world, a world in which full acceptance is still to be won.
We're Americans. We're fully Americans. That's not a problem, at least internally anyway. But the point is that there are always people out there who aren't willing to accept the fact that you're an American, or that they want to confer on you equal status, or maybe they want to take orders from you if you're the boss, or even put you in that position. And, you know, I mean, that has a lot to do with the way you look. And it seems because of the way we look, the automatic assumption is you must be from another country.
How long do you think it took you to get over the experience of the camps?
Yeah,
Days or years.
I don't think you ever get over a thing like that. You know, it's a wound that's there, you know. I mean, even if it doesn't hurt, the scar's still there. You know, you can still see the scars.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
My name is George Kiriyama. I'm the General Chair for this Manzanar reunion, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our fourth all-camp reunion.
Thank you for all your work.
This may be the last big reunion for the people who lived at Manzanar. But now in 1993, the catastrophe that struck the Japanese-American community 50 years ago is still a central point of reference in their communal and personal identity.
This seems like a very powerful emotional occasion.
I think it is. It gives people a chance to talk about their experiences, which they haven't done for a long time. And I think it's a catharsis for many people who have not talked about it, you know, for many, many years. And, you know, for people like myself and some of the other teachers who have been involved in teaching and giving out information about the camp, I think the catharsis was long over with, and we now try to do it in a more objective way. But for a lot of people, they have not really even opened their mouths for 50 years, and it's really a trauma for them to talk about it. And so we're just now beginning to find some people still, you know, talking about it.
The gracious God, and your steadfast love has caused us to remain faithful to you and truthful to one another. And we do thank you tonight. In the days of Manzanar, with memories of barbed wire, watchtowers, and imprisonment within fear and uncertainties, new hope and life emerged, so that our memories tonight are of friendship and solidarity and community. We thank you, O God, for the sacrifices of the Issei who had foresight to believe and persevere at great odds, that we might tonight inherit and enjoy the better things of life. Even in adversity, they remain faithful to their dreams to have the abundant life.